There are moments in history that don't just horrify you, they leave you wondering how something so deranged could unfold right under everyone's nose. In the late 70s, Sacramento became the backdrop for a case that blurred the line between insanity and pure nightmare. It started quietly: a man who claimed his heart was shrinking, that his blood was turning to dust. Doctors brushed it off. Family thought he'd get better. But what came next would expose the cracks in every system meant to stop him. This isn't about mystery, it's about descent. A mind unraveling, a city terrified, and a trail of horror no one could have predicted. Keep watching. This story goes deeper than anyone was ready for. When examining the life of Richard Trenton Chase, it becomes imperative not merely to chronicle the crimes for which he became notorious, but to trace the early roots of his personality, environment, and pathology. The origins of his homicidal trajectory are found in subtle yet significant patterns: family dynamics, early behavioral dysfunctions, and emerging psychosis. A powerful lesson lies here. The early life of a monster is often built on a foundation of warning signs that, in his case, remained unheeded. Born on the 23rd of May 1950 in Santa Clara County, California, Chase was the first of two children to Richard Sr. and Beatrice Chase. While some sources note an initial normal childhood, this surface stability masked a more fragile family ecosystem. His parents frequently argued, and on one memorable camping trip, his mother accused his father of infidelity, a confrontation she later recalled as having ruined the outing. There are also reports of disciplinary practices by the father, described in certain texts as beating his children, though not unusually harsh for the era, are added as qualifiers. Importantly, the family relocated to Sacramento when Richard was still a child, placing him in an environment that would later become the scene of his crimes. Within the family sphere, young Richard had his sister Pamela. Their relationship and sibling dynamic, while little discussed, are part of the broader canvas. What stands out is the early erosion of normative developmental structures, where many children experience a consistent sense of safety, identity formation, and social belonging. Chase's world appears punctuated by discord, mistrust, and internalizing of atypical narratives. By the age of 10, signs of profound behavioral and emotional disturbance began to emerge. Researchers and retrospective studies point to clear instances of the so-called McDonald triad: bedwetting beyond the age of 5, cruelty to animals, and fire setting, all of which have been imagined as risk factors for future violent behavior. Multiple accounts detail Chase killing small animals and drinking their blood. For example, later he admitted to killing dogs, cats, and rabbits for their blood. Evidence shows Chase set fires during childhood, a classic indicator of impulse control breakdown and sadistic curiosity. Enuresis, chronic bedwetting into later childhood, though less sensational, is documented in his schooling years. These early signs are not determinative in isolation, but in the mosaic of his life. They served as early warning signals of escalating psychopathology. The presence of the triad, in combination with later drug use, personality change, and psychotic thinking, indicated deep-seated dysfunction. An interesting note: during his adolescence, Chase maintained a facade of normalcy. He attended high school, participated in extracurriculars, and even hosted birthday parties with a large number of children attending. Yet behind this veneer, his inner world turned increasingly chaotic. As he moved into his teenage years, the cracks amplified. He began experimenting with drugs, marijuana, LSD, and struggled with sexual identity issues. For instance, one former girlfriend noted that his continual failure to achieve an erection led to their breakup. His self-concept became increasingly delusional. He believed himself to be a member of the James Younger gang, even pasting his own head onto photographs of its members, in an effort to live the narrative. He also engaged in bizarre sleep behaviors, sleeping naked in the family lounge, turning the heater to high and opening windows, perhaps signaling a deep disturbance in bodily self-regulation and comfort. Academically and socially, the decline was gradual but persistent. He enrolled at American River College, but eventually dropped out after failing to attend classes. His grades slipped, and his withdrawal into inner turmoil increased. What this narrative reveals is not only individual pathology, but the interplay of risk factors within his environment. The family's instability, early disruptions, emotional withdrawal, and lack of sustained intervention created fertile ground for a serious personality breakdown. The subsequent onset of substance use, delusional thinking, and stimulating dysfunction compounded his vulnerability. Several forensic and psychological studies describe his progress as consistent consistent with Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, stagnation or failure at key transitions, identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, leading to severe dysfunction. Moreover, the accepted theory of the McDonald triad suggests that the presence of those three markers, in his case, correlates with violent later life. But researchers emphasizes they are probabilistic, not deterministic. What matters is their presence in a context of other stressors. In Chase's case, the triad was coupled with unresolved internal conflict, sexual dysfunction, substance use, and paranoid ideation. The trajectory of Richard Trenton Chase's descent from a troubled young adult into one of the most infamous serial killers in U.S. history cannot be understood without a careful examination of his psychiatric history and the institutional system that intersected his life. Now I'll go through the complicated mix of being diagnosed, treated, discharged, and relapsing, all while the system kept breaking down. In December 1973, Chase entered the emergency room of American River Hospital, Sacramento, reporting that his blood had stopped flowing, that his pulmonary vein had been stolen, and that he was suffering a heart attack. A physician described him as tense, nervous, and wild-eyed, filthy, disheveled, and foul-smelling. Based on his presentation, he was diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia, though clinicians noted that drug-induced psychosis could not be excluded. He spent just 2 days on the psychiatric ward before his mother confronted staff and secured his discharge. In those early moments, Chase manifested classic symptoms of severe mental illness: hypochondriacal delusions, his pulmonary vein missing, somatic preoccupations, bizarre bodily function fears, and a rapidly deteriorating self-care routine. The brevity of his stay and the influence of family pressure to release him foreshadowed one of the major fault lines in his later trajectory: premature discharge, inadequate follow-up, and lack of sustained containment. Chase's behaviors had grown markedly more bizarre and alarming. Having rented an apartment, he boarded up doors, built escape hatches, and began heavy use of alcohol, marijuana, and LSD. He started capturing and killing animals, rabbits, birds, and in one documented incident injected rabbit blood into his own veins. That blood poisoning episode triggered his involuntary commitment in 1976 to a psychiatric facility. While institutionalized, staff observed him killing birds in his ward, broke the necks of 2 birds he caught through the institution window and drank their blood, and extracting blood from therapy dogs using stolen syringes. According to many accounts, hospital personnel began calling him Dracula due to his fixation on blood consumption. These episodes represent not simply escalation of deviance, but confirm deep-seated psychosis manifesting in ritualized violence, self-harm, and transgressive behavior well beyond regular antisocial conduct. His delusions blended bodily annihilation. He believed his heart was shrinking, with bizarre compensatory rituals, ingesting animal blood to stop his heart from shrinking. In 1976, after psychotropic treatment, Chase was deemed no longer a danger to society by certain institutional staff and was released into the custody of his mother. Crucially, his mother, disliking the way medication made him appear zombified, weaned him off the antipsychotics without consulting his treating physicians. Once freed, he was placed into his own apartment, but his psychosis was not resolved, merely suppressed. As one retrospective commentator put it, he was stabilized, roomed with housemates. The plan looked superficially acceptable, but once the roommates left, the isolation and lack of supervision allowed the pathology to re-emerge. What followed was swift deterioration, return to heavy drug use, resurgence of delusions, and hunger for animal blood, social isolation, and pre-murder violence. The institutional system's decision to release him and his family's decision to remove medication are widely seen as pivotal failure points in the chain of events. Looking at Chase's case through a broader lens reveals profound systemic weaknesses, diagnosis versus dangerousness. Although he was diagnosed early with paranoid schizophrenia, the fact that he was released despite ongoing profound rituals indicates that diagnosis alone did not guarantee safe containment. Some staff explicitly felt he remained dangerous. Treatment compliance and family involvement. The decision by his mother to withdraw medication underscores the importance of family psychiatrist coordination. Without enforced outpatient commitment or a supported living arrangement, relapse occurred. Institutional discharge planning. Chase was released to his mother's care and provided his own apartment, but the broader support system, supervised living, community mental health services, appears absent. This mirrors recurring critiques in mental health literature about the deinstitutionalization era. Risk of rapid escalation post-release. The temporal gap between his discharge and the murders was short. His clearance for release underestimated his level of ongoing risk. In sum, Chase's institutional history validates how a severe mental illness, coupled with ritualized violence, substance use, and inadequate support structures, can produce a catastrophic outcome even when treated repeated at intervals. The significance of this phase cannot be overstated. It is the hinge between early warning behaviors, childhood cruelty, fire setting, and the full-blown homicidal spree. Because, 1. It evidences that he knew something was wrong. The hospital records, the blood injections, the institutionalization, all show a man in psychological collapse, not simply evil by choice. 2. It shows what might have been prevented. If the system had maintained more stringent controls, longer commitment, enforced medication, supervised living, the murders might never have happened. 3. It demonstrates the interplay of psychosis and ritual. His vampiric delusions were not the mere invention of defense lawyers. They were documented in the institutional setting and reflect a severe fragmentation of self. 4. It underscores the danger of release decisions made on improvement rather than sustained stability. While superficially stable, Chase's underlying pathology remained active. As his early adulthood unfolded, the pathology beneath the surface of Richard Trenton Chase's life did not pause, it accelerated. What began in the obscure realm of animal cruelty quietly evolved into a fixation on blood, bodily violation, and ritualized violence. In this middle phase, the trajectory shifted from hidden deviance to full-blown homicidal preparation. Understanding this escalation is essential to comprehending how he moved from harming animals to killing humans. Once Chase left his mother's home and settled into an isolated apartment, the transformation grew tangible. Neighbors and former roommates reported strange behavior. Chase boarded up his bedroom door, built secret escape hatches from his unit, and began spending increasing time alone. Reportedly intoxicated with alcohol, he also displayed bizarre bodily rituals, walking nude, sitting with objects on his head, believing in their powers, and claiming his heart was shrinking. The animals he kept, rabbits, dogs, cats, was not simply pets. They became sacrificial objects in his internal mythology. According to multiple sources, he killed rabbits and birds, drank their blood, injected their blood into his veins, and in some cases disemboweled dogs, consumed raw flesh, and justified it as preventing the shrinking of his heart. This behavior cannot be dismissed as mere cruelty. In criminology and forensic psychology, it is recognized as a potent risk indicator. The well-documented link between animal cruelty and later human violence is strong. Research shows that individuals who torture, mutilate, or ingest animal bodies are far more likely to escalate to human victims. By December 1977, Chase had moved from animal killing to human murder. A .22 caliber firearm was purchased and later used in his first human homicide. According to the summary, he purchased a .22 caliber firearm in December 1977 and lied about his history of mental illness to do so. What is significant here is the transition point, the weaponization of his internal delusion and ritual. The first known human victim, Ambrose Griffin, was killed in a drive-by shooting on the 29th of December 1977. Griffin was simply unloading groceries. The act appeared randomly motivated, shocking investigators who initially believed it a solitary, senseless crime. But for Chase, the randomness belied the underlying logic of his own internal narrative. Blood needed to be collected, bodies controlled, rituals expanded into the human realm. In this shift, we see the core formula of escalation. Ritual becomes murder. Private pathology enters the public sphere. Several forces combined in Chase's escalation. The animals he slaughtered became objects of ritual. In killing humans, he extended that ritual logic. Body parts removed, organs rearranged, blood collected. It was not simply killing, it was the enactment of a delusional script. His mishmash of hypochondria, my heart is shrinking, vampiric imagery, and belief in bodily decay shifted into a framework where human blood and organs were not just desirable, they were necessary. His earlier blood drinking of animals set the stage. With his roommates gone, his mother at arm's length, and institutional control lifted, Chase's apartment and later his external outings became unmonitored territories. The freedom from surveillance and the presence of self-referential delusion allowed his violence to proliferate. Animal murder is one bracket, killing humans is another. For serial killers and violent offenders, such escalation often follows a need for greater reward control, power, novelty, or to maintain the emotional high. Research finds this pattern consistent across many violent crimes. In the final phase of his rampage, Chase committed a series of murders over a very short time frame, each escalating in brutality and ritual. Now, I go through those crimes in order, talking about the victims, how they were killed, and the disturbing details at each scene that expose what was going on in Chase's mind. On the evening of the 29th of December 1977, Chase committed his first known human homicide by a drive-by shooting. The victim was Ambrose Griffin, 51, who was walking with groceries near his home when he was struck. At this moment, the violence appears almost opportunistic. Griffin was not a specific target known to Chase, nor was there an obvious connection. Yet, It was the trigger event. The choice of weapon, a .22 caliber handgun, had already been procured by Chase in December 1977. While the scene is less ritualized than what follows, the speed, randomness, and lethality signal the shift from animal violence to human homicide. Roughly 3 weeks later, on January 23, Chase entered the home of Teresa Wallen, a 3-month pregnant woman, while she was taking out the trash. He shot her in the hand, then cheek, then head. After the shooting, Chase performed extreme mutilation. He removed her spleen, both kidneys, placed them in a certain arrangement on her body, drank her blood from a yogurt cup, and stuffed dog feces down her throat from her yard. Investigators later reported that she may still have been alive while the mutilation was taking place. The crime scene was among the most horrifically unique, deliberate, anatomical rearrangement, evidence of necrophilia, consumption of blood, insertion of excrement. The presence of such ritualized violence shows a dramatic escalation from the earlier homicide. This murder also indicates the emergence of symbolic violence. It was not enough to kill. Chase demanded possession, transformation, consumption of the body. 4 days after the Wallen murder, Chase invaded the home of Evelyn Miroth, 38, at her residence. Along with the presence of visitor Dan Meredith, her 6-year-old son Jason, and her nephew David, in a single event. He shot Meredith in the hallway. He then fatally shot Jason, the 6-year-old son. He shot Evelyn Miroth in her bathtub, or near it, and proceeded to mutilate her body in a manner similar to what was done to Wallen: removal of organs, cannibalism, and necrophilia. The toddler, David, 22 months old, was decapitated. His skull was split open and his brain matter removed. The body of the infant was later found in a box near a church after his body had been transported. At the scene, blood prints and shoe prints were very clearly visible because Chase did not attempt to conceal the scene. The handprints and footprints were in the victim's blood. Across these events, a few key patterns emerge. Use of firearm plus close-range mutilation, killing with a gun followed by ritual damage to body and organs, blood consumption. Chase collected his victim's blood, for example, Wallen's blood in a yogurt cup, and consumed it. Organ removal and rearrangement. Particularly in Wallen's case, the kidneys and spleen were removed and placed. Necrophilia and cannibalism. Sexual acts with corpses, ingestion of organs, and brain matter. Lack of attempt to conceal or disguise scene, these were not stealth killings. The scenes were left in chaotic, bloody form, revealing the psychological compulsion behind the acts. Violation of sacred thresholds. The invasion of private homes, including a mother with young children, meaning his violence extended into the most protected spaces. Rapid escalation and compressed timeline. The murders occurred within 1 month, from the first human homicide to multiple murders with extreme mutilation, signaling a spree rather than drawn-out series. The timeline shows that once the threshold to human killing was crossed on December 29, the subsequent murders followed quickly and with escalating intensity. The interval between first homicide and the last spree was very short, giving little time for intervention. The progression from a single adult victim, pregnant woman, with mutilation, entire family, including children and infants, indicates not just quantitative escalation, more victims, but qualitative escalation, greater cruelty, more symbolic violence. The crime scene signatures reflect a unique pathology, movement from animal ritual violence into human ritualized violence, with blood use, organ removal, necrophilia, and cannibalism. This helps us understand that Chase's murders were not simply killings for motive, for example, robbery, but killings for psychological compulsion and symbolic enactment. The failure to clean up or hide evidence indicates a man not afraid of being caught, or perhaps indifferent to being caught, suggesting his actions were driven by internal compulsion rather than attempt to evade detection. The presence of young children and infants as victims magnifies the impact. From adults to pregnant women to toddlers, the threshold of protected victims was crossed. This marks the event as not only serial killing but spree, home invasion massacre. Investigatively, the clear prints, the discarded bodies, and the rapid accumulation of evidence allowed him to be captured soon after, just hours after the last murders, showing how extreme acts can accelerate detection. In the wake of the brutal murders, the investigation into Richard Trenton Chase's crimes became a landmark in forensic profiling, rapid police work, and the intersection of deranged pathology with tangible evidence. What follows is an exploration of how law enforcement connected the dots, made the arrest, and built the case one that rests not only on gruesome crime scenes, but on the physical trail left by a perpetrator consumed by his own ritualistic violence. When investigators arrived at the scene of the 27th of January 1978, multi-victim murder, home invasion, children among victims, they found one of the most horrific crime scenes in Sacramento history. According to profiling sources, the scene contained body parts, blood-soaked rooms, organ removal, and evidence of cannibalism or necrophilia. This severity triggered rapid mobilization. Local police sought assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI Behavior Analysis Unit, and profiling took a central role. The case is often cited as a pivotal early instance of criminal profiling being used operationally. Investigators immediately made several deductions from the crime scene signatures. The perpetrator likely lived or spent time very close to the scene, given footprints, blood prints, and rapid escape. The level of mutilation and organ removal suggested ritualistic compulsive behavior, not simply instrumental killings. For example, robbery. The presence of a .22 caliber firearm was identified from shell casings and ballistics in earlier murders, connecting the December 29 shooting to the later events. These early investigative decisions narrowed the suspect field quickly. One of the critical pillars of the case was the collection and matching of physical evidence across multiple crime scenes and to Chase's residence. At the Miroth home, the murderer left bare hand prints and shoe prints in victims' blood, an unusual and remarkably clear form of direct trace evidence. Items found in his apartment included a blood-soaked food blender used to mix animal or human viscera and body parts stored wrapped in his fridge or freezer. The crime library article notes, body parts, empty pet collars, and a blood-stained food blender were found in his apartment. Investigators uncovered a calendar marked with dates, coincident with murder dates, and anatomical diagrams clipped from textbooks. This offered strong proof of planning and signature behavior. Ballistic evidence. The gun used in the initial shooting matched shells found at subsequent scenes. Gun purchase records tied Chase to a .22 caliber weapon procured in December 1977. The path from animal cruelty to human killing produced other forensic traces, dead animals, blood injections, rabbit blood poisoning, which supported the investigators' theory of escalation. Together, this forensic network turned a horrific crime spree into a solvable case. On the 27th of January 1978, the same day as the Miroth murders, Chase was located and arrested. Several converging paths led to that moment. Investigators identified his vehicle, abandoned car from the crime scene, parked near his apartment, placing him in proximity. The blood prints from the scene were compared, and forensic teams matched them to Chase's residence. Within his apartment, incriminating items mentioned above were found, prompting his immediate arrest by Sacramento police. Rarely had law enforcement dealt with such a blatant signature-driven killer. The rapid arrest prevented a longer killing series which profiling had predicted. Though Chase protested, claimed delusions and denied moral culpability, his physical proximity, forensic traces, and the timeline left little doubt. The prosecution's success hinged on turning the forensic facts into a coherent narrative of conscious decision-making, rather than mere psychosis absolution. Key arguments included premeditation indicators. Chase used rubber gloves, brought tools, selected unlocked doors, interpreting them as invitations, which the prosecution argued demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing. Signature behavior linking multiple murders. The distinct modus operandi, mutilation, organ removal, blood consumption, provided a chain of scenes evidencing the same perpetrator. Mental illness as factor, but not absolution. While Chase had a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, expert testimony during trial contended he knew the difference between right and wrong, the key legal standard for sanity. On the 8th of May, 1979, a jury found Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and rejected the insanity defense. He was sentenced to death. When the full magnitude of the crimes committed by Richard Chase came to light with 6 murders, including a pregnant woman, children, mutilation, blood consumption, and other extreme ritualized violence, the legal system faced one of its most complex, disturbing cases. The trial phase would test public sentiment, psychiatric interpretation, forensic evidence, and the parameters of legal insanity. By the time the trial commenced in early 1979, the media had already dubbed Chase the Vampire Killer of Sacramento. The sensational nature of the murders, blood drinking, cannibalism, infant victims created enormous public pressure. To ensure a fair trial, the proceedings were relocated from Sacramento to Palo Alto. According to a UPI report, the trial was moved due to widespread pre-trial publicity. Defense counsel faced daunting odds, the sheer volume of graphic evidence and the emotional response of victims' families and the public. The prosecution, meanwhile, had to establish not only guilt, but also Chase's legal legal sanity, the ability to understand right and wrong at the time of the killings, which is essential under California law to impose a death sentence. The defense opened by acknowledging that Chase was deeply mentally disturbed. From the pre-trial psychiatric records and testimony, it was clear he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, intense delusional beliefs, including that his heart was shrinking, that he needed to drink blood, etc. The defense sought to establish that Chase's mental disease rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongful nature of his acts or of controlling himself. Moreover, the defense argued for second-degree murder rather than first-degree in order to avoid the special circumstance death penalty eligibility. They characterized the killings less as calculated murder and more as psychotic episodes of ritual-driven violence. According to summary, while mentally disturbed, he still knew what he was doing was wrong. That sentence highlights the core tension in the trial. The defense also pointed to Chase's drug use, his hospitalization history, his animal mutilation rituals, and the breakdown of his mental health as mitigating factors. The prosecution countered by emphasizing that although Chase was disturbed, he still exhibited premeditated behavior and awareness of his actions. For example, he purchased a .22 caliber handgun in December 1977. He brought rubber gloves and other tools to crime scenes, indicating a conscious attempt to prepare for the killings. He attempted to dispose of body parts, store organs, and even preserved evidence, for example, blood in containers, which the prosecution argued required planning, not mere spontaneous psychosis. In addition, the prosecution stressed the signature nature of the crimes, blood drinking, organ removal, mutilation, as evidence that the killings were not random but the product of a consistent modus operandi. The jury was told that these factors demonstrated knowledge of what he was doing and the ability to appreciate its wrongfulness. According to a Washington Post article at the time, the jurors found that Chase, 28, was sane when he killed 6 victims. Psychiatrists testified Chase suffered from delusions in a persecution complex and drank the blood of his victims thinking it would cleanse him. The trial spanned several months in 1979 and included deliberations of psychiatric testimony, crime scene photographs, forensic evidence, and victim impact statements. Psychiatric experts testified for both sides. The defense's psychiatrists emphasized Chase's delusions, hallucinations, animal blood rituals, and long-standing history of psychosis. The prosecution's experts emphasized his capability for planning and execution. One often reported moment. While in custody, awaiting trial, Chase claimed his food was being poisoned and demanded tests of the meals, demonstrating both paranoia and the willingness to engage in legal process. The jury's deliberations lasted about 4.5 hours before returning verdicts. As reported, a jury said yesterday that convicted vampire killer Richard Chase should die in the gas chamber for 6 murders. On the 8th of May, 1979, the jury found Chase guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. They also rejected the defense's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury further found the special circumstances required under California law for eligibility for the death penalty. For example, multiple murders of children, were met. Consequently, the judge had the power to impose the death sentence. In short, guilt established beyond reasonable doubt. Sanity in the legal sense affirmed by the jury. Death sentence made legally permissible. The jury's recommendation of death paved the way for formal sentencing. On the 8th of June, 1979, the court scheduled sentencing. Chase was formally sentenced to die in California's gas chamber, though in practice this meant placement on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he awaited execution. The sentence carried not only the legal requirement of death, but a symbolic message of societal condemnation of not only the murders themselves, but the intentionality and cruelty underlying them. After his conviction in May 1979, Chase was transferred to the death row unit at San Quentin State Prison in California. Within the prison system, several notable points emerged. Fellow inmates were reportedly fearful of Chase, given the extreme violence and mutilation of his crimes. Prison records note that, soon after arriving, Chase's behavior deteriorated. He demanded transfers, claimed delusional conspiracies, UFOs poisonings, and exhibited classic signs of chronic psychosis. In December 1979, he was temporarily transferred from San Quentin to a state hospital facility for the criminally insane in Vacaville, California, before being returned in April 1980. This period underscores that, despite being incarcerated, Chase's mental illness remained pronounced and largely unmanaged in ways that might have altered his course. On the 26th of December 1980, at around 11:05 a.m., Chase was found dead in his cell at San Quentin. The body was discovered by a guard during the lunch meal check. Chase was last seen alive around 7:45 a.m. that morning. The autopsy concluded that the cause of death was an overdose of the antidepressant Sinequin at 36 times the prescribed dose. He had been hoarding the pills in his cell. Whether his death was ruled suicide, accidental overdose, or self-harm remains somewhat ambiguous, though prison officials treated it as a likely suicide. 1. Failure of containment and treatment. Chase's incarceration period reveals that even in the controlled setting of death row, his psychosis and self-harming potential were not adequately managed. The fact he hoarded a large quantity of medication suggests monitoring and psychiatric oversight were insufficient. 2. Symbolic versus actual closure. His death in custody meant that the death sentence he received was never carried out. The symbolic notion of justice served is thus tempered by the reality that his life ended not via execution but via overdose. Some might argue this outcome raises questions about the death penalty's practical value. The system denied him liberty, yet fatality came through other means. 3. Mental illness, incarceration, and death. The final chapter of his life gives further weight to the argument that extreme offenders with severe psychosis challenge the binary of criminal versus insane. Chase's medical records, prison behavior, and ultimate demise suggest a man in profound mental collapse, even while legally considered sane for the purposes of trial. 4. Victim-centric perspective. While the focus often remains on the killer, Chase's death also represents a moment of closure for the families of his victims. The fact that he did not roam free and ultimately died in custody may offer some limited consolation, but it also underscores that the system's intervention came after the murders, not before. The incarceration and death phase of Richard Chase's life closes the loop of one of the most disturbing crime sprees in modern U.S. history. The serial killings, the forensic investigation, the trial, and finally the incarceration all link into a narrative of extreme pathology, systemic missteps, and eventual institutional transition into a cell. His death by overdose in prison adds a final twist. The killer, whose every act was about blood, death, and denial of life, ultimately died deprived of freedom, yet not executed in the formal sense. One of the most important shifts in the aftermath has been toward victim-centered narratives. The victims of Chase, such as Teresa Wallen and the Miroth family, are increasingly remembered not merely as statistics or elements of a serial killer story, but as lives lost, families impacted, and societal failure points. Memorial discussions now often include questions such as, what support was provided to the families? What long-term trauma remains? How do we balance public fascination with respect for survivors? Investigative journalism and academic reports point toward the broader impact of homicide on families, the immediate responsibilities, emotional fallout, and long-term needs. In recent years, commentators and scholars have revisited the Chase case not just as a horror story, but as a cautionary study. The case thus remains a touchstone for policy reform discussions and forensic training. The aftermath of Richard Trenton Chase's crimes is not simply about a killer being captured and punished. It is about surviving families and systemic lessons that remain relevant. The case reminds us that extreme violence rarely emerges entirely unheralded, that behind the iconography of horror lies a chain of human, institutional, and societal failings. Remembering the victims, learning the lessons, and examining the system's cracks are the only ways to move from spectacle toward prevention.